Hello, very beautiful community. Let's do a quick analysis of the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer saying that in principle he's open to British troops on the ground in Ukraine. Keir Starmer is a centrist technocrat, and you know what I think about the historical predicament of that kind of politics. I'm skeptical about it. But he's a responsible, non-entrepreneurial politician, and certainly anybody in my life who's interacted with him has positive things to say about him personally. So he is trying to carve out a position of leadership here, and he says Europe must play its role, and I'm prepared to consider committing British troops on the ground alongside others if there is a lasting peace agreement. There must be a US backstop because US security guarantee is the only way to effectively deter Russia from attacking Ukraine again. In this moment, we have to recognize that we're in a new era and not cling hopelessly to the comforts of the past. Now, let's just do an elementary bit of big picture stuff that we all know about. And that's that, of course, many commentators say that there's not much risk of Putin going again. He's had a go, and he's had very mixed results, and he's done. And I think that is an elementary misinterpretation of the intent and trajectory of the Kremlin. They are after political control over Ukraine, and they're prosecuting a regime security war. That's to say there's a constitutive link between foreign escalation and, I would even argue, war and regime security for Putin. And that war is not just a regime security war, it's also, in the second instance, an expression of a kind of a mystical vision of escalation against the West that propels Russia from the front row to from the back row to the front row of nations. Now, having said this, it's also true that when Ukraine supporters and Ukraine says, well, it's us now, but you Europeans are next, Western Europeans in particular don't know on the whole what that could possibly mean, because it's hard to imagine Putin waving a magic wand and, 10xing the size of his army and magically reconstituting his army in an impossibly rapid period of time. And so Europeans think, well, there's no Russian army is going to be marching through our homes, so what is this conversation about? And I think that this is a miscommunication across purposes that is easy to resolve by pointing out the possibility of the Kremlin challenging Article 5, possibly at the lowest threshold of challenge. I do think that that's possible. I've talked about it being possible for a while, and I think it's as possible as it has ever been, in part because Article 5 is the weakest it's ever been, and if Putin were to challenge it 3 or 4 years from now, his prospects for being successful are not low. Now, what we straight away have to ask is, what does committing British forces on the ground alongside others in Ukraine mean? Is that some kind of somewhat meaningless monitoring force? Is that some force in West Ukraine? Is it a force that's going to potentially come into contact with Russian troops if they invade? And what does an American backstop mean? Does it mean air support, intelligence? So it's a very open-ended statement, which I won't try to elaborate further because I'm going to leave that to military experts. Well, let me just quote a military expert, in fact, Mike Kaufman, who has said, "I'm skeptical that European nations can deploy and sustain a large force in Ukraine, but I also don't think they have to. The initial requirements are not insurmountable and should not be exaggerated as an alibi for doing nothing." Well, let me say that Starmer's statement is spectacularly open-ended, and there's a risk of being a free rider in it. That's to say, there is a risk that a couple of Western European powers say, oh yeah, we're in for troops on the ground, but they're free riding on other countries saying no, meaning they will never be asked to follow through on their verbal commitment. So there really is a risk of it being too easy to say this, knowing how difficult it's going to be to put together in practice. So what's my cumulative political analysis here? Well, there are two elements to this that mustn't be forgotten. One is European incapacity, and the second is the Russians have to agree to this, right? As part of the deal. So we can't forget about that. So we've got to have a situation where the Europeans get their act together and somehow the Russians agree to it. And it is, on the whole, a very disagreeable prospect indeed for Putin, having Western troops on the ground in Ukraine. So let's say something briefly about the second element of the equation, Europeans getting their act together. At the moment, in this historical moment, we are experiencing a rise of populism of a somewhat anti-democratic kind in Europe, and most of these political movements are Ukraine skeptical. I think that's a very significant fact, that there is actually a conflict between democratic sustenance and support for Ukraine in much of the West. Second, defense spending tends to be a byproduct of budgetary politics that is both electorally and ideologically confined to a narrow space, and it's very hard for European countries to overcome that. And third, there is genuinely that absence of threat in Western Europe coming from the Russians, absence of a perception of a threat. Now, how would I cast the threat as it actually stands? Well, the threat as it stands is the dissolution of NATO and Russia and China controlling the security arrangements on European territory. That's the threat. The threat is not that Russia is going to march through Berlin. But it's very, very hard to push it through Western political systems, this idea. And so what I would say is that tendentiously, defending Ukraine's survival from Putin is a less important priority than the avoidance of direct conflict between, direct contact between Russian and European troops on the battlefield, which means that while I'm not ruling out the idea of Western troops on Ukrainian territory, indeed, I've been advocating for a security guarantee for Ukraine on the channels for a long time. But in practice, I want to say that that's not where we're trending. We're trending away from meaningful security guarantees to Ukraine and toward the idea that Ukraine just survives in virtue of being reasonably enough supported militarily and in other ways by Western powers. I don't want to say this is impossible, but I want to say that the correct position about Western troops on the ground in Ukraine is, for now, one of skepticism. This is a thing we are at a great distance from today. Lots of love.